very fortunate in the sense that I've got to do a lot of great things in my life, including running Marvel Comics and rock and roll, after having a sordid career in engineering and mergers and acquisitions. So it's interesting when I get asked to speak at these kind of events, what do I talk about? But, you know, I'm shocked that you all are still here. It's great after 2 days. I wish I'd been here earlier. But it's so great because now we can talk about something that really matters, rock and roll. And exactly, thank you. I am working without a net today because normally when I do this, I've got sights, sounds, records, videos, and everything, and it helps explain this to you. But you just got to have to take my word for what I tell you today. It's the truth, I promise. What I have to do in my allotted time, I think, is to really try to make sure that I sort of true up any misconceptions you have about this music, where it came from, and its impact. And I suspect most of you take this music for granted. You know who's great, you know who's terrible. You're mad at me because certain people are inducted and others aren't inducted, and I'll be meeting with you on the side thing here. And Rush may actually get in this year if there are any Canadians in the audience here. It always gets an applause. I can use that no matter where I go. So, you know, I am here to convince you about some of your ideas are wrong about this music, and here's why. Because this is the most impactful art form ever created by man, or woman, as the case may be. In fact, that's probably one of the main reasons that in Cleveland, Ohio, how many of you have been to the museum? Anybody been to the museum? That's not bad, not bad, not bad. It's not as cold. Global warming, we're going to have palm trees and pelicans pretty soon, so come on up. But it's the reason we have a museum, and we now have a library and archives where scholars come from around the world to study this music that we call rock and roll. And we define that very broadly. Now, first we got to deal with where this came from. The curtain doesn't come up one day and there's Elvis, Bill Haley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and suddenly there's rock and roll. Voila! It doesn't work that way at all. What you need to understand is this is an art form based in African culture. These are drum beats and syncopations that came to the United States over 3 centuries ago, and they have wound their way through our history for that period of time. Now there's field chants, there's work songs, there's minstrels, there's ragtime, there's jazz, there's blues, there's gospel, there's boogie-woogie. There's race, there's sepia, there's rhythm and blues. These are all names that have attached themselves to this river of music. Now, this river of music has changed our lives and still does, and I often say that it's the greatest book that's never been written about the history of the United States in terms of sex, race, and economics. And if I live long enough, I hope to be one of the people that helps to write that, and I mean that sincerely. Just so you'll know, the term rock and roll goes back to 1923, and it's really traced back to a song by Trixie Smith, which is My Daddy Rocks Me with One Steady Roll. Now, you can immediately tell from that song what the word means. It always meant sex in black parlance, and if you don't know the record, it also talks about what you do at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. So, believe it or not, you can trace the origins of rock around the clock back to 1923. And that happens a long time before we hear of Elvis and those other people. In fact, there are hundreds of songs about rock and roll, with rock and roll in the title, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, long before we see any of these big stars. Interesting enough, 2 of those rubrics that I mentioned before, rhythm and blues and rock and roll, really came about in order to replace terms that had sort of a pejorative connotation. Rhythm and blues actually arises because in 1949, Jerry Wexler, who's one of our inductees who helped found Atlantic Records, decided that the 2 charts in Billboard, which was race music and hillbilly music, were both incorrect, and that's where you get country and western, because he replaced hillbilly with country and western. He replaced race music with rhythm and blues. And believe it or not, amazingly enough, in 1952, Alan Freed, the disc jockey who coined the term rock and roll in Cleveland, did it largely because he thought rhythm and blues was still a negative connotation or too black for the audience that he wanted to achieve. He knew it meant sex. He basically told the folks around him that he was pretty sure the black community didn't care, and he knew the white people didn't know. So he said, I'm going to name it that anyway. And you have to understand, up until the late 40s and early 1950s, there was very little black music programming. There were no black radio stations. And suddenly in the late 40s, mid-40s to late 40s and early 50s, you have basically more white disc jockeys showing up playing race music than called rhythm and blues, and then Alan calls it rock and roll. And many are operating on large stations out of major markets, blasting this raucous, up-tempo dance music around the country, and it seduces both black and white youth. And if I were playing music right now, I'd first play for you, It Ain't the Meat, It's the Motion, My Baby Just Loves My Big 10-inch record of the blues, And then I would juxtapose that with How Much Is That Doggy in the Window by Patti Page. And those of you who are old enough to know that last song, you'd understand why rhythm and blues and rock and roll won out. Now, this is really, it's a perfect storm. There was a sea change happening, and this is a period right mixed up where you have Brown versus the Board of Education. You got Rosa Parks, and all this is coming together with so many other changes. Is a real flashpoint, a Big Bang period. This is a point where television comes in, and because of all this, this music is everywhere. You can't get away from it. And also, the solid body guitar is suddenly introduced as a major instrument. It starts to replace the sax and the piano from the race music days. Even the invention of the 45 RPM record comes around. You can't imagine this light, flexible little piece of... Who in here doesn't know what a record is? I have to ask this question. I'm sure there are people here who haven't seen one. We actually have a pressing plant in Cleveland that a guy bought, and he retired and bought it, and it's running 24 hours a day, producing 45s and LPs for young groups and major stars. We're very proud of that. But, you know, this is really all starting to undermine the establishment, all this. You got pompadours, you got sideburns, you got outrageous clothes. I had all of that stuff in the 50s. I dressed in all red, I dressed in all black. Nobody would sit next to me on the school bus in Alabama, where I grew up, which is not too surprising. And I survived that, you know, but this really was a sea change. And rock and roll also attacked the economic food chain. And most people don't realize this, that up until this point in time, there was a imaginary place called Tin Pan Alley. And this is where a lot of songs were written. They were shoved out to band leaders. And suddenly you have all these young groups, black and white, writing their own music. They're self-contained. And lo and behold, blacks and country stars weren't published very well by ASCAP, which controlled that world of royalty collecting. Suddenly BMI becomes the leading publisher of music. All the major labels who refuse to record this black music or this raucous white music or hillbilly music, now you've got all these independent labels. So you've really hit them where it hurts. So between both the financial and the cultural changes, you've got the beginning of a real revolution. Far more so than one everyone thought of, and probably not one that you look back to very often. When this all starts, it's the sound of the music that's the challenge. Now, it's not just the drums and the guitar. You got to understand that this is being recorded in basements and closets and elevators all around America with noises and sounds that become part of the music itself. And whereas before, recordings were supposed to be a perfect reflection of how the artist performed, now suddenly this is part of the gestalt of the music. It's where it's recorded and what it sounds like. And as the artists themselves then discover, besides the noise that they're making, they can be agents of change. Now, as the 50s fade away and establishment's really getting hit hard here, you know, I don't know if you know what happened. Elvis gets drafted. There's a lot of issues about that. Chuck Berry and some of the Platters go to prison for trumped-up charges. And the biggest thing was Congress, yes, the United States Congress, and I heard earlier one of the professors talking about what's happening at that level. They took on rock and roll. They're going to get rid of it. So they went after payola, which is the idea of paying money to play records, which was not illegal, by the way, in the United States. It was not illegal. Having said that, it got Alan Freed, it ruined his life, it ruined many of the other disc jockeys, Dick Clark being one of the few that survived. He was smart enough to figure out how to get around it. And so they thought they would kill this music called rock and roll. It still persisted, though. And in fact, it continued to evolve and morph. And you've heard it, and believe it or not, these are just other names for it. We call it soul, folk rock, country rock, funk, disco, punk, hip-hop. These are all derivatives. These are all tributaries of this music. Now, this all comes from that same wellspring, from that same artesian source. And that's that African-American beats and rhythms. Without that, nothing is possible. Now, throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the ramifications of all this music and these artists became more and more evident. Now, the practitioners of the music became the largest bunch of idealists that have ever lived, and they had the largest microphone that ever existed. Think about it. Just think about it. I mean, seriously. And they continue and have been promoting a vision of a more righteous world, whether you agree with it or not. And they've come to be a very strong balancing point to anything that opposes it. As many of you know, and I think this is probably true, probably the earliest gospels, I know you're not supposed to talk about religion here, but the earliest gospels you heard about altruism or protest probably came from some of the rock songs of the day. And that's where you got it. Rock and roll, as we broadly defined it, has played a significant role in civil rights, women's rights, the Green Movement, almost every major issue you can think of. And what other art form has given artists the influence and, yes, the wealth to go out and tackle global issues? Think Bono with AIDS and third world debt. Who else plays a role in electing world leaders? Think Springsteen, think Jay-Z. It's truly remarkable the impact that these artists and these songs have had on our lives. Think of the enormous amount of money that's been raised by activities like the Concert for Bangladesh, and I mention that because that's George Harrison, and that's really the first one. Farm Aid, the telethon for Katrina, the concert that's coming up in New York 2 weeks from now for Sandy. Millions and millions of dollars. Finally, besides this impact, I have to leave you the fact that this music, it hasn't stopped, it hasn't ended, it's morphed again. Hip-hop being one of the most dominant forms of rock and roll, and yes, we put it under that tent, as I said earlier, is joined today by electronic dance music. EDM is largely the dominant genre in music today. And few think of that as rock and roll. But once again, it goes back to the beats and syncopations that came out of Africa. Now, whether you're talking about an artist, an EDM that has samples, mashups, or original music, again, still the same source, so we include it underneath there. Once you get past the nomenclature, we also read how rock is dead. Ain't true, don't believe it. I promise you that the youth of today, and even the marginalized voices out there, still turn to music as the best way to express themselves and try to create a better world. Whether it's a two-person combo, and that happens to be close to me because the Black Keys came out of Akron, which is only a few miles down the road, or a kid with a computer and a turntable sitting in his house. You know, this is all the rock and roll today. The antecedents and derivatives of rock and roll continue to change the world. This is an art form that runs the gamut from Elvis to Kanye to Lady Gaga to Skrillex to Deadmau5. Musicologists will tell you, they admit they can't tell you where it began. There's no first rock and roll record, but they do know it won't end. And it's really amazing that the poet laureate, the first poet laureate of rock and roll, Mr. Chuck Berry, got it right in 1957 when he said, "Hail, hail, rock and roll, deliver me from the days of old." Thank you.